There's a place where the fish are biting, the campers are cooking up the day's catch, and a 150-year-old grist mill sits quietly overseeing one of Missouri's 9 fish hatcheries. I'm Jim Viebrock. I've been photographing, documenting, and now videoing old water mills for over 30 years. This is Montauk State Park, and I'm here to explore the Montauk Mill. Let's have a look around.
There were a total of 3 mills built in this valley. This structure was built in 1896 by a gentleman named Timothy Hackman. This mill was built further away from the water for a reason. The other mills had been plagued with flooding events and fire events. We'll talk more about those later in the video. This structure also is built uniquely because of the way the wood is stacked instead of having the hollow walls. Let's take a look at that. Great condition, but it's built a little bit different.
It sure is. It is built different. As we can see on the walls, the lumber is stacked lumber. And it's not just any stacked lumber, it's the true 2x that they had back in the day. But perhaps even more importantly was the flammability is reduced.
It would take a lot more heat to get this started.
Sure, or you get those flash explosions. If you just had skinny little planks with air on the other side, you might light the walls on fire, whereas this, you might get a flash explosion, and it's over.
Yeah. Now, the most common reason these mills were lost to history due to fire is because wheat and corn is highly flammable in its dry state. So imagine what's happening inside this mill as they are grinding the flour in here. There is a lot of dust in the air, and a lot of these mills had metal or cast iron gears. Metal on metal creates a spark. And then you could have a flash fire, and with all the dry material and the mill itself being dry wood, it just went up like a match. About an hour south of here was a hotbed of activity with the Civil War. A lot of these mills simply were burned as one side retreated and the other side took over. And the reason for that was because these mills were the economic center for the places where they were located. And if you could destroy the mill, then you could disrupt the economy for the area in which it served.
Let's talk about the mill dam for a moment. Not only are they beautiful and oftentimes the focal point of the outside of the mill, but the dam also serves a very important role in the overall operation. The dam is the battery, so to speak, for the mill. The purpose of the dam is to create the mill pond, which backs up enough water in a reservoir to operate the mill for extended periods of time and during low water events.
Okay, for the mill to be powered, you have to be able to get the water from the mill pond to the mill in some way. Now, this mill uses a turbine, and I'll talk about that last. But there are other ways that you could have got water to the mill and powered the mill. The most iconic and most photographed way is through an overshot wheel. Now, this would be a Fritz water wheel that was over on the side of the mill, and you would have a chase or a flume come to just past top dead center of the wheel. The water would cascade out of it into the weight of the water in the buckets would cause the wheel to turn, and through inertia the mill would operate very smoothly. Now, an undershot wheel works the same way, except the water turns the wheel from the bottom side as it races through, and in that case the wheel would turn backwards. Now, this particular mill uses a turbine. We'll take a closer look at it here in a minute, but to get the water to this mill you would need what is called a race, and that's what this ditch is beside me here. The water would be directed into this, where it would then go into a room underneath the mill, and that is called a penstock. The deeper the water in the penstock, the more horsepower the turbine is going to have, because the turbine works off of static water pressure. So inside the mill there is a wheel that opens the wicket gates on the turbine, and that allows the water to come through the turbine, turning a propeller on the inside, and then the water is discharged out the bottom and goes on downstream. Very efficient way to operate these mills, and keep in mind, they didn't have electricity in these very remote locations. So the water wheel or the turbine was the total amount of power that these mills had, and I think it's really cool. Okay, let's talk about the mill stones for a minute. You're going to have two different halves here. The bed stone, which is stationary, the running stone, which is the one that turns against the other one. These are really cool. They're very similar to the ones that's going to be inside in the stone grinders that are in there. And I think these stones actually were in this mill at one point because they have an inscription here. But how they work is you'll see all these lines in here. That is what moves the corn kernels or the wheat kernels around through the stones as they're working against each other. The kernels will come in through the center, and they will begin to grind as they move through this, as it turns around through here. The further out it comes, the finer it's going to be. If you look at these, they're a little bit concave if they're cut right. So as it comes to the outer edge, it gets finer and finer and finer. Then once it's on the outer edge, then it's thrown outside of the furniture housing that holds it all together. Now these do wear down over time, and they have to be recut. That is called dressing the stone. These are really cool. This one here probably weighs over a ton. Now these were very hard to move because of their weight. So you'll see that they have holes in the side of them like this. A special crane came down with a C-clamp that they picked them up, and then they could redress them and work on them or just flat out replace them.
Inside of Montauk Mill is a horizontal stone mill that would have used millstones like the ones we talked about outside. The grinder would operate off of a belt hooked to the turbine shaft. The wheat germ or dried corn kernels would be placed in the hopper above the stones, and a shaker mechanism would align the kernels as they fall in between the stones. The distance between the stones would determine how coarse or fine the grindings would be. The mill also features 3 roller mills on display. These began to replace the stone mill after the turn of the century. They work by having at least 2 steel drums called rollers that crush the product to the desired consistency. The roller mills on display are not the original ones to this mill. To support the war effort, the original roller mills were melted down to build tanks and ships for the military. In order to be ground, the corn kernels have to be removed from the cob. That's accomplished by using a corn sheller. Montauk Mill has 2 small box-mounted type shellers on display. More likely for a mill this size would have been a 1 or 2 hole cabinet style corn sheller. The millwright would either hand crank these or hook them to the central belt pulley system and let the water power operate the sheller.
Okay, let's talk about the furniture piece that goes around the millstones. The stones would be in here. In most applications, the bed stone's down in the floor. The running stone is up here. There is a space in between the inside edge of the siding, this furniture piece, and the edge of the stone. The bigger that space is, the more product that would be caught in there and not brought out and sent through the bolters to be bagged. This caused a problem, so much so that federal legislation had to be passed to regulate how much space there could be between the inside of this furniture piece and the stone to guarantee that the farmer got what they actually paid for. Okay, up here on the second floor of Montauk Mill, you'll see they've got about 6 different types of separators in here, and each one of them has their own special job. Now, with corn, you don't have to go down quite as fine as you do with cornmeal and stuff. So 1 or 2 of these would handle the separation there. But with flour, you've got to get it really pulverized and really down into a cake type consistency. So it's going to go through these different bolters, and each one has a different setting to it. And by the time it makes it through all of those bolters and it gets reground and reground and reground, it finally makes it through the finest bolter setting they have here, and then it's ready to package and be sold to the town folks. I mentioned earlier that the other incarnations of this mill elsewhere in the valley were plagued with flooding events. That is not uncommon, just simply because of the geographic location where these mills sat. Most of the time they are very close to a water channel of some kind. And as you know, creeks and rivers flood from time to time, and these mills were just absolutely plagued with high water events. a large tree can float. So you can have a tree that weighs a ton or more acting as a battering ram to hit this structure. And if it does that, it just obliterates the side of the building and all of the contents of the mill go floating downstream. It was a big problem for these mills. Inside of Montauk Mill is this really cool general store display. It came from a small store in Hope, Missouri. It's not uncommon for there to be a general store close to the mill. After all, the mill was the economic center of most of the communities that it served. And it makes perfect sense because when the farmer would bring his crop to the mill to be processed, they did other things. They would get their hair cut. They would go to the general store and they would get provisions that they need. Now, they didn't come to town like you and I do every day. They would only come a couple of times of the year. So the entire family came, and it was a big outing. A lot of times, they would go to church. They would have ice cream socials. The mill was the center point of attention for these small communities. When the mill was doing well, the community did well too. When the mill did bad or closed, the community faltered. Okay, Montauk Mill operated for a total of 31 years. The last millwright to own it was Grover Brigham, and he sold the mill to what is now the Missouri Department of Natural Resources in 1926, with the understanding that he could operate the mill in 1927 for a full season, which he did. In the 1930s, the mill was taken over by Company 1770 of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, what they did is they created the grounds that are now the state park. They also operated the mill, and they created the fish hatchery here. So there were lots of people here working under that company. What's your favorite part of this mill?
I think my favorite part, and it's going to be something that's hard to put your finger on, but when people walk in that door and they kind of take like a bit of a deep breath, because it's a bit like stepping back in time. And so it's not necessarily a thing. I think it's the experience and seeing the experience in people's eyes and faces and look at the equipment that we have here and just kind of like live history a little bit. That would be my favorite part.
I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Montauk Mill here in Montauk State Park. If you're ever in central Missouri, this is a place you must stop and see.